500 people, 500 powerful, wealthy, influential people, and not one of them moved. She was bleeding on the floor of the most expensive ballroom in the city. Her husband stood over her, straightening his jacket. His mistress walked away laughing. His mother raised her champagne glass. And the crowd just watched. They thought they were watching a nobody fall apart. They had no idea they were watching the owner of the building bleed on her own floor. What happened in the next 60 minutes didn't just destroy 3 people's lives. It rewrote every single rule they thought protected them. Because the woman they humiliated in front of everyone, she didn't need their sympathy. She didn't need their witnesses. She just needed one old security guard to recognize a silver pendant. This story is a reminder that the people who try to silence you are only afraid because deep down they already know you are exactly who they hoped you'd never become. If this hits something inside you, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. We tell stories like this every week. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in her place? And if someone in your life needs to hear this today, share it with them. They'll thank you for it.
That moment of humiliation was years in the making. 72 hours before, Lenora was a different person. Not transformed, but erased. She had been slowly and methodically taken apart over 5 years, piece by piece, until she no longer recognized the sound of her own voice when it wasn't saying, "I'm sorry." That Tuesday began at 5:15 in the morning, in an apartment she could barely keep, waking in a bed that felt enormous because his side was cold and untouched. Her husband hadn't been home again. This was no longer a surprise. Surprise is born from expectation. And she had stopped expecting anything from Darnell, Washington, a very long time ago. But she made breakfast for 2 anyway. Scrambled eggs with cheese, toast with butter, coffee with cream, and 2 sugars, just how he liked it. As always, 1 plate would be scraped into the trash bin before she left for work, leaving her with that familiar pang of waste and sorrow that had become her morning ritual. She kept the apartment spotless, always ready for his mother Beverly's pop-ins, where she'd run a finger over surfaces, searching for dust like a health inspector. The only beautiful thing she owned was a photo of her grandparents, Thomas and Ruth, their smiles so wide you could feel their warmth through the glass. She touched the frame on her way out, a habit she'd formed after they'd both passed, taking their secrets with them. She drove to the hospital in a car with 187,000 miles. Its check engine light, a tiny orange warning she couldn't afford to heed. Darnell had borrowed her savings for a business opportunity that never paid off, and she'd learned it was better not to ask. But at Riverside Memorial Hospital, Lenora was someone else entirely. In pediatric oncology, she was a quiet force, the one the kids called Miss Lenora, and the one whose name every grateful parent mentioned. That morning, her supervisor, Dr. Crawford, gave her news that made her heart lift for the first time in weeks. "Lenora, you're being considered for the head nurse position. You've earned it. Your patient outcomes are the best on the floor." The words brought good tears to her eyes, the kind she'd almost forgotten. She floated through the morning on that sliver of hope. At lunch, her best friend Clara found her in the break room, staring at her phone's blank screen. "Girl, are you sitting here, waiting for that man to text you?" Clara asked, setting down 2 containers of pasta with purpose. "You're eating cafeteria salad because he borrowed your grocery money. Let me tell you something. When someone shows you who they are, believe them the first time." Lenora laughed, a sound so rare it surprised her. Claire's voice softened. "You deserve so much more than this, Lenora. You know that, right?" Lenora instinctively touched her pendant. "I know," she whispered. But she didn't know the whole truth. She didn't know her grandparents, Thomas and Ruth Harrison, had built a $60 billion empire and hidden it, wanting her to find a partner who loved her for who she was, not what she had. So they left her with only the little wooden house, the photo, and the silver pendant, the key. And 5 years ago, a charming man named Darnell Washington had said all the right things, never realizing the quiet, struggling nurse he was marrying already owned the world he was so desperate to conquer. The crisp sound of the legal papers being served was the sweetest music Lenora had ever heard. From her new apartment window, she watched the process server hand the envelope to a stunned Darnell, his face a perfect mask of disbelief. In her hand, she held the keys to her future, the silence of her own space, a welcome change from the noise of his cruelty. At the head of his mother's table, Darnell, no longer a king in a castle he didn't pay for, was finally facing the consequences. Beside him, Beverly, a 58-year-old woman whose gala attire couldn't mask her shock, looked on, and Candace Thornton, the 33-year-old attorney, was about to learn that some rooms rearrange themselves in ways you never expect. The confidence she wore like armor had been pierced. The story she told, with her hand on his arm now, had an ending she hadn't written. Lenora took a quiet sip of tea, remembering her friend Clara's words about building a boat. The storm had come, but her boat was sailing, leaving them all in the wreckage. Beverly had once sneered that failure followed Lenora, but today justice had found its way home. Lenora finally felt like she could take up space in the world again, no longer a guest in her own life. And on her wrist, catching the afternoon light, was not the bracelet he'd given her, but a new one she had bought for herself. That journey from ruin to restoration began the day her world fell apart. She had stood in her living room, clutching a box of memories from a 7-year career, and listened to Darnell call her dead weight. She saw the flash of guilt in his eyes before it vanished, replaced by cold indifference. It was in that moment of perfect clarity, hearing his mother on speakerphone, planning the divorce with Candace, that she knew surviving was not enough. The coordinated cruelty wasn't just careless. It was a campaign designed to destroy her, and she decided right then that they would not win. The whispers in her head, telling her they were right, finally went silent, replaced by a steady, quiet resolve. That resolve solidified into a plan. Lenore remembered Clara's advice. You don't survive in the water, you build a boat. So she started building. She gathered every cruel text message, every bank statement showing her salary paying for his life, and found an attorney who saw the calculated destruction for what it was. She learned that anonymous, detailed complaints, especially when crafted by a rival attorney, could be traced. Darnell thought he was giving the bracelet to whoever he wanted, but in the eyes of the law, he was giving Lenora evidence. Beverly's words about her clinging like a barnacle became a key part of the emotional distress claim. The campaign against her had been brutally efficient, engineered by a woman who wanted Lenora left with nothing. The day she was fired was the day Candace's plan seemed to work perfectly. Lenora had walked out of Riverside Memorial Hospital in a daze, her life's work packed into a cardboard box. Seeing Candace getting out of a sleek car, wearing a suit that screamed business, was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't a mean smile or a friendly smile. It was the satisfied smirk of a winner. Candace didn't have to say a word. As she walked into the administrative building, Lenora understood that the strategic destruction of her career had been a complete success. Before that moment in the parking lot, she'd been in a state of shock, listening to the HR director, Sandra Cole, list the fabricated allegations, aggressive outbursts, theft, inappropriate conduct, lies crafted to sound real. Her badge hadn't worked, the red light blinking like a final judgment. She'd been escorted like a criminal from the place she'd dedicated 7 years of her life to. She had begged them to ask Dr. Crawford, to ask anyone who knew her, But the investigation was a sham, designed by Candace to isolate her. That morning had started with the quiet hope that maybe things would be different, that she wouldn't feel so afraid in her own life. But fear had been her constant companion. The night before she was fired, she'd retreated to her bedroom, the sound of Darnell, his mother, and Candace laughing at her expense echoing from her own kitchen. The humiliation was a physical weight. "She was wearing my bracelet, Clara," she'd whispered into the phone, her voice small and broken. "In my house, at my table." Clara's response had been the first flicker of light in the darkness. "The audacity of these people could power a small city," she'd said, her voice firm. "You need to start making a plan." Lenora had protested that she was just trying to survive. "No. No, baby," Clara had insisted, her tone shifting to something serious and tender. "There's a difference between surviving and planning." That night, Lenora had sat in the dark, touching the pendant from her grandmother, wondering if she was brave enough to build that boat. She didn't know the answer yet, only that the laughter from the other room was the sound of her drowning. It all came to a head when she finally found her voice, steady and quiet, and pointed to the gold chain on the other woman's wrist. "That is my bracelet," she said, shocking even herself with the sound of her own strength. Candace had looked up then, with the lazy disinterest of a predator that knows its prey is already trapped. The table went silent. Darnell's jaw tightened, the warning of a storm brewing in his eyes. He claimed the bracelet was his to give, that Lenora clung to things she didn't deserve. Beverly chimed in with theatrical satisfaction, calling her a barnacle on her son's boat. And Candace delivered the final blow, lifting her wrist so the delicate heart pendant caught the light. "Darnell has wonderful taste," she'd said, her smile a weapon aimed directly at Lenora's heart. And so it all began on a Tuesday evening. A tired Lenora walked through her front door, only to find 3 people sitting at her kitchen table. Her husband, Darnell, was holding court from the head of the table, a position he'd recently taken in the home her nursing salary paid for. To his left was his mother, Beverly, and to his right was his business partner, Candace. The air was thick with the smell of Italian food from the restaurant where she and Darnell had their first date, a place she could no longer afford. The way Candace leaned into him, the triumph in her eyes, told a story that needed no words. Lenora had no idea, in that moment, that she wasn't just walking into her kitchen. She was walking into the beginning of the end and the start of a whole new life. This time, Lenora walked back into the ballroom through the main entrance, not the side door. She wasn't the ghost who had slipped in 4 hours earlier. She was no longer invisible, no longer small or quiet, and she was done apologizing for simply existing. "You had an asset strategy for the Mitchell estate, didn't you?" Lenora's voice was calm amidst the gala's buzz, aimed directly at Darnell and Candace. "My grandparents' property in Georgia, the small house where Thomas and Ruth showed me what real love was, something this mansion has never seen." She let that sink in. "I saw your emails, the 3 months of planning to take it all, every one of those 40 acres. Your valuation was between $200,000 and $300,000, she continued, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Enough to fund the next phase, right? Darnell would file for divorce. You'd represent him, Candace. You'd claim I was mentally unstable, using those fake hospital complaints as proof. You'd sell the property, split the cash, and leave me with absolutely nothing. Your final email was so concise. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 begins at the Gala Friday. Be ready." Well, here I am. But they hadn't known that just 24 hours earlier, she had made a phone call that changed everything. She hadn't screamed or confronted them after finding their plan. Instead, she heard her grandmother's voice in her memory. When someone is digging their own grave, baby girl, do not take the shovel out of their hands. So she took a deep breath, screenshotted every single message, sent them to herself. And then, for the first time in years, she started to think. That call was the culmination of a sleepless night spent not in despair, but in planning. Feeling like herself for the first time in ages. Darnell had stumbled home at 3 in the morning, reeking of expensive perfume and cheap whiskey, completely oblivious. And at 9, Claire had shown up, with wine and a fierce loyalty, ready to listen. They're planning to divorce me and have me declared mentally unfit, Lenora had explained, the words tasting like ash. They want my grandparents' property. Candace is the one who got you suspended, Lenora had told Claire, the pieces finally clicking into place. Claire set her wine down, a sign of true gravity. Tell me everything, she commanded, her mind already racing. And then, maybe just some aggressive note-leaving. Lenora laid out the entire scheme, the emails, the bracelet, the systematic campaign of cruelty designed to break her down and leave her with nothing. After a long silence, Claire's focus sharpened. We need your grandmother's papers, all of them. We have to know exactly what they left you. So they had spent the morning unpacking boxes from the back of the closet, sealed by 2 years of grief. It was an archaeology of love and loss, old photos, birthday cards, recipes in a careful hand. As Claire sorted the papers with a surprising reverence, she suddenly went still. Lenora, she said, her voice hushed with shock. Who is Marcus Harrison? Lenora had no idea. Why? Claire held up a document. Because according to this birth certificate, he's your father. The world tilted as Lenora knelt to take the paper. It was official, embossed with a state seal. Father, Marcus Allen Harrison. Mother, Diana Rose Harrison. Child, Lenora Ruth Harrison. Harrison, the name on her pendant. There's more, Claire said, pulling out an adoption certificate and letters from a law firm named Vincent and Associates. And Lenora, there's a letter from your grandmother. It's sealed. It says, open when the time is right. She held the envelope, her grandmother's elegant script making her eyes well up. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. The letter, smelling faintly of lavender, explained everything. My dearest baby girl, it began, if you are reading this, I am gone, and it's time you knew the truth. Your real parents, Marcus and Diana Harrison, loved you more than life itself. Our family built an empire, but with wealth came danger. They asked us to raise you in secret, away from the Harrison name. We wanted you to know your worth wasn't about money, but you need to know who you are. You are the sole heir to the Harrison dynasty. The estate, the foundation, all of it belongs to you. It's been held in trust by a man named Gregory Vincent until your 32nd birthday. On that day, you must claim what is yours. He has been looking for you. We love you forever, your grandmother Ruth. In the silence that followed, Clara whispered, Lenora, the Harrison estate. The gala tomorrow is at the Harrison estate mansion. Lenora stared at her, a new reality crashing down. I know, Clara breathed. That's a $60 billion property. I think you own it. Lenora glanced at the pendant on her neck. L.H. Harrison Legacy, and finally understood. She picked up her phone and dialed the number from the law firm's letterhead. A woman answered, Vincent and Associates. Lenora's voice was steady. This is Lenora Harrison. I believe Mr. Vincent has been looking for me. After 4 seconds of stunned silence, the woman replied, her voice thick with emotion. Please hold, Miss Harrison. Mr. Vincent came on the line with the urgent relief of a man who had found something precious just before a deadline. Miss Harrison, we've been looking for 3 years. Your grandmother was our only contact. The trust activates on your 32nd birthday, tomorrow. This is a conversation for in person, but I can tell you that you are the sole heir to everything your parents built. It all started because she'd been suspended from work, desperate for income to just breathe, and had opened her laptop to see Darnell's email still logged in. As her husband's venomous question hit her, something new and unbending rose inside Lenora. The familiar knot of fear in her chest was still there, a ghost of 5 years of training, but beneath it was a core of absolute steel. Darnell's eyes raked over her simple dress with disgust. His mother, Beverly, appeared like a vulture, suggesting security be called. Then Candace, his mistress, completed their circle of contempt, a champagne flute in her hand. She suggested letting Lenora stay for the entertainment, comparing her to a lost animal at a fancy show. But the words didn't land. They couldn't touch the quiet truth that had been forged in a cold bank lobby and strengthened in a dear friend's warm kitchen just the night before. What they couldn't possibly know was that this was all part of a careful plan. Only an hour earlier, her best friend Clara had been adjusting the small pendant around her neck, a final touch on a borrowed black dress that fit as if made for her. The instructions from Mr. Vincent were clear. Arrive through the service entrance at 8:30, then blend in. Observe Darnell, but do not engage. Let him think he had all the power. As Lenora gave Clara a desperate, grateful hug, her friend had been unwavering. Nothing would go wrong, she'd insisted, already placing a bet on the epic expression Darnell would make when the truth finally came out. She was betting he'd freeze up like a statue. She walked into the ballroom of her own home, a place she hadn't known was hers until 24 hours ago. Feeling like a spy? The sheer strangeness of it all, wearing shoes a half size too small from Clara, almost made her lightheaded. Darnell was easy to spot, the center of attention, holding a drink like a king holding a scepter. Candace was at his side, her hand possessively on his arm, already looking around as if she were planning to redecorate. Beverly was nearby, draped in designer clothes, and broadcasting her own inflated sense of importance to anyone who would listen. They were a perfect portrait of arrogance, completely unaware they were merely guests in the home of the woman they despised. Lenora kept to the edges of the vast room, making herself small as she had learned to do, but now her invisibility was a weapon. She studied the layout, the art, the history of a family she was just now discovering. In a quiet hallway, she found it. A portrait of Marcus and Diana Harrison. Her parents. She saw her own eyes in her father's face and recognized her hands in her mother's. They looked genuinely happy, and the enormous weight of the sacrifice they made to keep her safe settled heavily in her heart. She was still lost in their faces when Darnell's voice, low and menacing, finally found her, furious that his public image might be threatened by her mere presence. That newfound strength had been hard-won just hours earlier. That afternoon, Lenora had gone to the bank, needing funds to escape. A new phone, a lawyer, enough to get by. But the ATM screen was a death sentence. Checking account, $0.00. Savings account, $0.00. Every penny she had ever earned or saved was gone. A call to the bank confirmed her worst fear. Darnell, as a joint account holder, had transferred all of it to a new investment account that morning. She was left with absolutely nothing. When she called him, his voice was chillingly casual. He claimed he'd moved their money for their future and that she should be thanking him. When she told him she couldn't access a single cent, he told her she'd better stay on his good side, then hung up. She stood in the bank, the phone feeling like a brick in her hand. Less than a day ago, she'd learned she was the heir to $60 billion. A few hours ago, she'd felt powerful. Now, she couldn't even buy a coffee. Her call to Clara was met with immediate, colorful rage. "You are staying at my apartment tonight," Clara had commanded. "I have wine and I have rage, and both are at your service." Surrounded by Clara's plants and fierce loyalty, Lenora felt utterly defeated. She had no money, no job, and no proof of Darnell's theft. Knowing he could wipe any evidence from her phone remotely. She was a billionaire on paper, but in that moment, she felt like the poorest person on earth. Clara took her hands and looked her straight in the eye. "You have the truth," she said, "and tomorrow night you're going to walk into your house and let the truth do its job." It had been Clara's words that echoed in her mind. When Lenora worried it wouldn't be enough, Clara squeezed her hands tighter. "It is always enough," she had promised. "It just doesn't always feel like it at the time." And so, on Friday evening, Lenora watched as luxury cars delivered the city's elite to the glowing Harrison estate. 500 of the most powerful people, all performing for each other, gathered in a grand ballroom with crystal chandeliers and marble floors imported from Tuscany, and among them, the true owner of it all was about to arrive, her identity a secret, ready to let the truth finally have its say. Everything had changed with a single, unexpected phone call. A man named Gregory Vincent, a name she'd never heard, had reached her. "There's a gala tomorrow evening at the Harrison estate," he'd said. "It is the annual charity event your parents established 30 years ago, Miss Harrison. It is your home." Lenora could barely process the words. "My home," then came the rest. He explained that trust documents revealed her parents had suspected their fatal car crash was no accident. That was why they had hidden her away, giving up their lives with her just to ensure she had one. The deflections and vague stories from her adoptive parents, Ruth and Thomas, suddenly snapped into focus. It wasn't deception, it was protection. With her world tilting on its axis, Lenora told Mr. Vincent something he needed to know. "My husband has no idea who I am," she said, her voice steady. "No one in my life does." Mr. Vincent paused, then replied that the next night would be very interesting indeed, and that he would arrange for security. After the call, as she and Clara sat on the floor, surrounded by life-altering documents, the absurdity of it all became clear. "So," Clara said, piecing it together, "your husband, who has spent 5 years telling you you're worthless, is scheming to get your grandparents' tiny property while you secretly own a $60 billion estate." Lenora could only nod. "Girl," Clara breathed, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The nerve of these people could power a small city, but yours could light up the entire eastern seaboard." And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Lenora felt a spark. It wasn't just hope. It was something sharper, something with teeth. It was the beginning. So that's how it all started. "You are home now, Miss Harrison." In the quiet sanctuary of a private room, the words from the estate's security head, Wilson, finally settled the chaos. Gregory Vincent, the family's attorney, stood by, his presence a silent confirmation of the unbelievable truth. This moment of safety was the end of a nightmare, a victory secured because just minutes earlier, a 40-year-old promise had been fulfilled. Wilson had looked at the woman crumpled on the ballroom floor and seen more than a victim. He saw the daughter of the house. Marcus Harrison's eyes staring back at him. That recognition changed everything, pulling her from a life of lies and into the start of her legacy. It was a small silver pendant that triggered the rescue. Skidding across the polished marble, it came to rest against Wilson's shoe. He didn't hesitate. Kneeling beside Lenora, he saw the inscription he'd been told about 30 years ago, L. H. Harrison Legacy. This was the key Marcus Harrison had created to identify his hidden daughter. While her shoulder throbbed and blood dotted her lip, Wilson saw past the pain to the unmistakable features of her parents. He picked up the pendant, his hands trembling slightly, not with age, but with the weight of the moment he had awaited for 4 decades. His quiet, decisive action was a direct response to an act of shocking public cruelty. With the crowd's judgment as his shield, Darnell's mask of concern, had dropped completely. "You are nothing," he had hissed, his voice raw with a fury he no longer tried to hide. "You came from nothing, and you will leave with nothing." Then came the shove, a violent thrust that sent her stumbling backward, her heels catching in the hem of her borrowed dress. She fell hard, the impact echoing through the silent ballroom. As her body hit the stone, the silver pendant, her grandmother's last gift, snapped from its chain. He had felt untouchable, emboldened because his trap had worked perfectly. Lenora had reached for her phone, ready to expose him, only to find the screen blank. The evidence was gone. Every screenshot, every incriminating email had been erased. Darnell had leaned in, his whisper of venomous confession only she could hear. "Find My Phone is a wonderful app, Lenora." To the room, however, he was a pillar of patience. Candace, the professional, was already planting seeds of doubt among the guests, her voice dripping with false concern over Lenora's mental health issues. Beverly played her part perfectly, adding the finishing touches to the narrative of a troubled orphan. No upbringing, no stability, she'd sighed to a captivated audience. The coordinated attack was flawless. It had turned 500 witnesses not into allies, but into spectators at the unraveling of a woman they were now certain was delusional. Darnell grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the soft flesh above her elbow, the mask of the gentle husband gone. "I told you to leave," he hissed, pulling her toward the door as the crowd murmured in sympathy for him. No one questioned him. Of the 500 faces staring back at her, a mix of pity and morbid fascination, not a single one showed a flicker of doubt. She saw then that they all believed the lie. Real, gut-wrenching tears finally broke through, the kind that distort your face and steal your breath. "Doesn't anyone see what is happening?" she pleaded, her voice cracking. This utter helplessness, this complete isolation, was the climax of a confrontation she had walked into believing she would win. She had been so certain. She had approached Darnell in the center of the glittering ballroom, her voice clear and steady as she made her accusation. "I know about the emails, Darnell. I know about the plan to take my grandmother's property." A hush had fallen over the guests, the kind of silence that anticipates a spectacle. Champagne glasses tilted as everyone leaned in, eager for a story they could recount at brunch. Darnell's face had flashed from genuine surprise to cold calculation before settling on the perfect defense, righteous indignation. "You are delusional," he denounced, his voice loud enough for all to hear. He immediately began performing the role of the long-suffering husband. "She has been like this for months, paranoid, aggressive." Beverly had chimed in right on cue, adding that Lenora's recent job loss was a symptom of her instability, and Candace, playing the part of the reasonable, legal expert, delivered the final, critical line meant to seal the trap, warning Lenora about the seriousness of making unprovable accusations. It was the perfect setup for Lenora to present her proof, and she was sure she had it. She reached for her phone with steady hands, ready to show the world the screenshots that would destroy them all. The email chains, the asset strategies, the texts between Darnell and Candace detailing her ruin. This was the moment she had planned for, the instant where irrefutable truth would finally shatter their web of power and deceit. This was the justice her grandmother had wanted for her. That confidence, that unwavering belief in the power of truth, was born 2 weeks earlier with a letter. It arrived after her grandmother's funeral, a final message from the woman who had raised her. Ruth, a woman who lived a simple life in a small house in Georgia, had given up everything: a fortune, a family name, a world of luxury to keep one secret safe. She had done it all because she loved her granddaughter more than anything else in the world. Tucked inside the envelope with the letter was the silver pendant. The letter itself contained a story that unraveled everything Lenora thought she knew about her own life, revealing a name she'd never heard: Harrison. It was a map leading her out of a life built on a lie and a call to action to reclaim what was stolen. That letter is why she stood in that ballroom, wearing a borrowed dress like a suit of armor, ready to confront the man who had tried to erase her. So that's how it all began. Just moments before, that victory had seemed impossible. A corporate shark named Derek Hollister had cornered her, his threat hanging in the air like poison. He knew of a clause in her parents' trust. If the heir couldn't prove sound judgment by their 32nd birthday, the $60 billion estate would fall into a conservatorship. His smile was predatory. "And I've already filed a petition," he'd said. "Arguing a psychiatric commitment order hardly meets that standard." The plan she and her lawyer, Vincent, had built collapsed. But through the panic, Lenora's voice was calm. "That commitment," she asked, "who approves it?" "A judge," Vincent told her, "within 72 hours. Her eyes found his. "Is Judge Holloway still in the ballroom?" It all happened because, on the other side of the wall, three people's worlds were imploding. While Darnell, Beverly, and Candace toasted to their success, the ground was vanishing beneath their feet. A real estate developer, Richard Calloway, had approached Darnell, his face pale. "When were you going to mention your wife is a Harrison?" he'd asked. Darnell had just laughed, calling her a nobody from Georgia. Then the hospital chairman cornered Beverly, informing her that the complaints against her daughter-in-law were now a criminal fraud investigation. Finally, Candace's phone rang. It was the managing partner from her law firm. The call was short, ending with two chilling words: Monday morning. They looked at each other across the glittering room, bewildered and afraid, sensing a predator they couldn't see. Their confusion was the result of Lenora's quiet, precise instructions. She hadn't wanted a public spectacle. She wanted justice. She had asked Vincent to discreetly speak to three key people at the gala. First, he showed Dr. Thomas Reed, the hospital's chairman, definitive proof that the complaints against Lenora Harrison were fabricated by a corrupt attorney. Next, he informed Richard Calloway, Darnell's business partner, that his associate's wife was the sole owner of the entire Harrison estate. Vincent's final conversation was with Judge Patricia Holloway. He presented her with security footage of Darnell shoving Lenora, evidence of systemic financial abuse, and proof of a 5-year campaign of psychological warfare. The judge watched the video twice, her expression hardening into one that every defense attorney in the state knew to fear. Lenora didn't need 500 witnesses to feel her own power. She just needed the right three. That power was brand new, revealed to her less than an hour earlier in a small private room. Vincent, the lawyer who had spent 3 years searching for her, finally sat before her, his relief so deep it looked like sorrow. "Miss Harrison," he'd said, opening a leather briefcase, "I'm so sorry it took this long." He laid out the truth on the table. Trust documents naming her the sole beneficiary, deeds to 47 properties, and controlling shares in Harrison Industries. Beside them, Wilson, a loyal family retainer, stood by the door, tears streaming down his weathered face. The event that set everything in motion was an act of public violence. Darnell had pushed her to the marble floor. Security cameras captured every second. Vincent had told her gently, "What would you like to do?" And Lenora, thinking of the 5 years of abuse, had surprised him. "I don't want revenge," she said. "I want justice." Her first call was to her friend Clara, who was audibly stress-eating cheesecake. "I need you at the Harrison estate," Lenora said, "and bring the laptop and the cheesecake." Then she turned back to Vincent, her mind already sharpened into a weapon, and asked 3 critical questions about blocking a fraudulent psychiatric hold, tracing stolen money, and the criminal penalty for fabricating legal complaints. It all started in a living room that no longer felt like hers. Beverly's voice had crackled through the phone, sharp and cruel. "I told you, son, she is dead weight. Cut her loose before she drags you down." She'd pushed for a quick divorce orchestrated by Candace, Darnell's mistress. Lenore had caught a flicker of guilt in Darnell's eyes, but it vanished before she could be sure. "We'll talk later, Mom," he'd muttered, hanging up. Standing there, holding a cardboard box of her children's drawings, she understood, with chilling clarity, this wasn't just cruelty. It was a coordinated campaign to destroy her. That night, after Darnell had left for wherever he went, Lenora sat alone at her kitchen table. She opened her ancient laptop, the screen flickering to life, and began to update her resume. She needed to find a new job. She needed to start over. With a honk that was pure Clara, the car pulled up. "Lenora Harrison," she yelled out the window. "Get in this car right now, or we'll be late for the ribbon cutting. And I absolutely did not get my hair done for nothing." A genuine laugh bubbled up from deep inside Lenora, warm and full of life. She touched the simple headstones one last time, her fingers tracing the names Thomas and Ruth Harrison. "I love you both," she whispered. "I'll make you proud." In the rearview mirror, as they drove toward the new women's shelter, the cemetery shrank into the distance. For just a second, under the afternoon sun, you might have sworn you saw 2 figures standing by the graves. An old man with kind eyes, and a woman who smelled of lavender, watching her go. With the practiced authority of a woman who commanded respect, Judge Patricia Holloway stood at the center of the ballroom, microphone in hand. A profound silence washed over the 500 guests, their champagne glasses frozen mid-air. "Ladies and gentlemen," the judge began, her voice cutting through the tension, "I have several announcements. First, an emergency protective order is now in effect against Mr. Darnell Washington for domestic battery, an act committed before hundreds of witnesses." Darnell shot up, his chair clattering to the floor. "This is outrageous," he seethed, but the judge paid him no mind, her gaze sweeping the room. "Second, a fraudulent psychiatric commitment order filed against Mrs. Washington has been summarily dismissed. The attorney behind it, Miss Candace Thornton," the judge continued, her tone hardening, "is being referred to the state bar for disbarment and to the district attorney for criminal investigation." Candace, whose eyes had already been mapping escape routes, turned for the door, only to find her path blocked by 2 imposing security guards. Judge Holloway's voice deepened. "Third, a petition from Mr. Derek Hollister to place the Harrison estate into a conservatorship is denied." Across the room, Derek calmly placed his glass on a tray and walked out, a man who knew dabati, a total loss, when he saw one. "And finally," the judge said. The silence, now so thick it was almost a physical presence. "As many of you are aware, the Harrison family has been without a direct heir for 30 years, since the tragic deaths of Marcus and Diana Harrison. Tonight, it is my profound honor to introduce their daughter, the sole heir to this estate and all its holdings, Miss Lenora Harrison." At that moment, Lenora walked through the main entrance. She wore a simple black dress, her lip was still swollen, and a silver pendant hung around her neck. She didn't need dramatic flair, she just needed to be herself. The ballroom exploded in a tidal wave of whispers and gasps, as 500 people suddenly understood the truth. The quiet woman Darnell had belittled, the orphan Beverly had dismissed, the woman Candace had schemed against, she owned the very ground they stood on. Darnell's face went slack, his cruel mind unable to process the new reality. The blood drained from his face until he looked like a ghost at his own funeral. "That's impossible," he whispered. "She's a nobody." Mr. Vincent, the estate trustee, stepped forward, his voice resonating with 40 years of loyalty. "She has everything. This $60 billion mansion is hers. The Harrison Foundation is hers. The entire dynasty belongs to Miss Lenora Harrison. It always has." The sound of Beverly's champagne flute shattering on the marble floor was the only sound, as sharp and final as a closing chapter. But this victory wasn't won in that public moment. It was secured just minutes before, in a private study off the main hall. It was there Lenora stood before Judge Holloway, her voice clear and steady. "Your Honor, my name is Lenora Harrison. In 30 minutes, a fraudulent commitment order with my name on it will be filed by that attorney, Candace Thornton, at the behest of Derek Hollister. They intend to use it to seize my inheritance." Judge Holloway listened, her expression unreadable. "And why should I believe you?" she had asked. "Because Mr. Wilson, who has served this estate for 4 decades, can verify who I am," Lenora answered calmly. "Because Mr. Vincent, the head trustee, has every document you need, and because my husband, the man who shoved me to the floor tonight, is laughing with the woman who tried to have me committed." The judge had looked out at the ballroom, seeing Darnell's strained laughter and Candace's nervous glances. "Show me everything," she had commanded. On the table, Vincent laid out a lifetime of proof: medical and financial records, the fabricated hospital complaints, and the email chain Darnell thought he'd deleted, now recovered by Vincent's team. Security footage from 3 angles played on a tablet, showing Darnell's assault in high definition. After reviewing it all, Judge Holloway had looked at Lenora with newfound respect. "Miss Harrison," she said, "the people who try to silence you are the ones most afraid of your voice. You didn't need to shout tonight. You just needed to show up." But even that quiet meeting was only the end of a plan set in motion by an act of stunning cruelty just 2 hours earlier. Lenora had been standing by the orchestra when Darnell, enraged by some minor slight, shoved her hard. She fell, her head hitting the marble, her lip splitting open. The 500 guests stared, yet not a single person moved to help. Beverly had sneered, "Honestly, Darnell, must you bring your charity cases everywhere?" Candace had smirked, adjusting the very bracelet Darnell had bought with Lenora's money. The humiliation was a cold weight in the room. Lying there, with her shoulders screaming in pain, Lenora felt not defeat, but a cold, hard clarity. This had to end tonight. It was Clara, a catering assistant, who rushed to her side with a cloth for her lip. "The audacity of these people," she whispered fiercely, "could power a whole city." As Clara helped her up, an older man in a staff uniform approached, his face etched with concern. It was Wilson. His eyes, however, weren't on her injury, but on the silver pendant that had come loose from her dress. It was a family heirloom, the one thing she had from her parents. "Miss Harrison?" he breathed, his voice trembling with a recognition that was 30 years in the making. He knew that pendant. He knew who she was. And in that instant, everything changed. Darnell's act of violence had not silenced his wife. It had reawakened an heiress. That single moment of recognition was the key that unlocked a future she was finally ready to claim, and it was a future that would utterly dismantle the three people who believed she was worthless. Lenora looked at Darnell, whose world had just collapsed. "You shoved me to the floor of my own house," she said, her voice soft but clear. "And the worst part isn't that you didn't know it was mine, it's that it shouldn't have mattered." She then turned to Beverly, who was shrinking in her chair. "You saw me as worthless. The only thing that changed for you tonight was learning I have money." Finally, her eyes rested on Candace, who stood frozen between the security guards. "You allied yourself with a man you thought was powerful, but he has nothing. He never did. And now neither do you." As security led the trio away, the guests stood in a thick, uncomfortable silence, the weight of their own inaction pressing down on them. They had watched a woman be assaulted and had done nothing. And so, it all came back to the beginning of the night, when Lenora had walked into the grand ballroom, a quiet nurse in a borrowed dress, completely unaware that her husband's cruelty would be the very thing that would finally set her free. It was their legacy she was building. 6 months after reclaiming her life, she stood in that same Georgia cemetery, placing fresh flowers on their graves. The Harrison estate, once a monument to cold ambition, was now a vibrant community center. Its marble halls, where she had once bled, now echoed with the laughter of children at birthday parties. She had personally overseen its transformation, filling the space with color, children's art, and joy. She founded the Ruth and Thomas Harrison Foundation, which had already awarded 400 scholarships to kids in foster care, kids being raised by their grandparents, kids who, like her, had been told they were nothing. She lived a simple life now, in a quiet house, with a regular car, pouring her energy into her work. She had found her voice in her own ballroom, standing before a crowd in a borrowed dress. She didn't speak of forgiveness. She simply made a declaration. "This gala will continue," she announced, her voice clear and steady. "All donations tonight will go to scholarships for orphaned children in memory of my parents, Marcus and Diana Harrison." She paused, then added, "And in honor of my grandparents, Thomas and Ruth, who taught me my worth was never about money." The applause that erupted was a complex storm of guilt, admiration, and profound relief. It was the sound of people realizing they had just witnessed something unforgettable. But just moments before that speech, their victory had felt like a house of cards. "By morning," he had said, straightening his jacket, "I'll have a court order placing the entire Harrison estate under my conservatorship. Then I'll buy it for pennies." The room fell silent. Lenora looked at Vincent, who looked at Wilson. The plan they had built was collapsing. Then Lenora's voice cut through the despair, calm and sharp. "That's a psychiatric commitment. Who has to sign off on it?" Vincent replied, "A judge, within 72 hours. A spark lit in Lenora's eyes. "Is Judge Holloway still in the ballroom?" Vincent's eyes widened. "Yes, she is." Lenora stood tall. "Then we need to go talk to her. Right now." 4 hours earlier, she had slipped into that ballroom through a side door like a ghost. She had been invisible for so long, a small, quiet presence, apologizing for her own existence. Mornings were still hard sometimes. A sudden movement could still make her flinch. She'd wake at 5:15, checking the other side of the bed, before she remembered that she lived alone now, that the emptiness was a choice, a peaceful solitude instead of a painful one. Healing wasn't a final destination, it was a daily practice. It was the act of choosing herself again and again, even when the old voices whispered she wasn't worth it. But those voices were growing quieter now, and her own was finally getting stronger. She learned about true wealth on Sunday afternoons by a fishing pond in Georgia, from a grandfather who taught her that what you have is not who you are. The silver pendant she always wore, a connection to the parents she never knew, caught the light as she knelt in the grass. "Thank you," she whispered to her grandparents. "Thank you for protecting me, for teaching me that my value was never in what others saw, but in who I am when no one is watching." They had raised her real family, and had given her everything that truly mattered. It was their love that she carried, their wisdom that armed her. What others saw, what they coveted, was the $60 billion. That was the inheritance that made her a target, the unshakable truth of her wealth. But the greatest inheritance her grandparents had given her was the knowledge that her worth was never, not for a single moment, defined by a bank account. It was always and only determined by her character. And her character, as it turned out, was extraordinary. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.